Chapter 1. Dust on the Horizon. The prairie stretched wide and empty, the kind of emptiness that pressed on a man's chest if he thought too long on it. The late afternoon sun bled orange across the horizon, setting fire to the clouds that hovered low over the plains. Dust kicked up under the hooves of Elias Carter's gelding, the dry earth whispering with every step as though the land itself was too tired to protest his passage. Elias shifted in the saddle, the leather creaking beneath his weight. 40 years on this earth, and yet the silence of his ranch followed him wherever he went, as constant as the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush. He tugged his hat lower to shield his eyes, though the sun wasn't what troubled him. It was the hollowness. The nights spent with only the crackle of the fire for company, the mornings where no one waited at the table but his own shadow. Folks in town whispered he was a good man, but cursed with solitude. Old Carter, they called him, never known a woman proper. The horse slowed as a ranch came into sight. A stretch of weathered fencing, a small cabin leaning against the prairie wind, and the big barn standing solid like a sentinel. Elias exhaled, the faintest ache tugging at his chest. His father had built that barn with his own hands, back when the ranch bustled with cattle and neighbors came calling. Now, only the horses remained, their soft knickers greeting him as he swung down from the saddle. He led the gelding into the barn. Inside, the air smelled of hay and leather, dust motes floating golden in the shafts of light, cutting through the boards. Elias stroked the horse's neck, murmuring low, "Good boy, Duke. Another day done." The words echoed back at him, hollow. He swallowed against the dryness in his throat and hung the bridle on a nail, fingers lingering longer than needed. He wasn't a man for talking much, but sometimes the silence pressed too heavy, and he found himself speaking just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. Outside, thunder rolled across the plains. A storm was gathering fast, the kind that could turn the dirt road into a mire and leave a man stranded if he wasn't careful. Elias stepped out of the barn and squinted at the sky. Dark clouds stacked thick, and the wind carried the faint howl of a coyote far in the distance. He rubbed the back of his neck, uneasy. Storms had a way of stirring up more than just rain. The memory of town earlier that day flashed in his mind. The saloons, swinging doors, the sharp laughter of card players, the clink of spurs on the wooden floors. He hadn't lingered long. Elias never did. A whiskey and a word with the barkeep, that was enough. Still, he'd felt the stares. He always did. The women with their painted lips looked through him, as though they knew his secret, knew he'd never once crossed the threshold into their world. The men, some pitying, some mocking, had clapped his shoulder and called him gentle as a church boy. He hated that most of all, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. The first fat raindrop splattered against his hand, dragging him back to the present. Elias hurried to latch the barn doors tight, the wood groaning under his grip. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the wide stretch of prairie in a ghostly white. For a heartbeat, he saw everything too clearly. The sagging fence, the cabin's empty windows, the vast loneliness that mirrored his own. He ducked inside the barn again as the storm broke full. Rain hammered the roof like rifle fire, and the horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Elias ran a hand down one mare's mane, speaking soft calmer. His voice cracked slightly, the weight of years pressing against his chest. The storm would pass like all storms did. He told himself that. But as he stood there, listening to the rain and the restless animals, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving toward him across that dark horizon. Something more than thunder, more than wind. Elias Carter, lonely rancher, virgin at 40, felt it in his bones. Change was coming, and it would find him here in this barn before the storm was through. Chapter 2. A Knock in the Storm. The storm battered the barn like a furious beast trying to tear its way inside. Wind shrieked through the cracks. Rain hammered the roof, and the horses stomped nervously in their stalls. Elias Carter tightened the last rope on a loose shutter, his broad shoulders tense under the flicker of lightning. Then, bang, bang, bang. The sound wasn't thunder. It was a fist against the barn door. Elias froze, the hair on the back of his neck bristling. Visitors never came this far out, not in weather like this. He reached instinctively for the shotgun propped against the hay bale, his calloused fingers curling around the worn with stock. Another knock came, desperate, muffled by the roar of the storm. "Please." A woman's voice, strained, nearly carried away by the wind. Elias's heart lurched. A woman? Out here in this weather? He pulled the heavy door open, bracing against the gale. A figure stumbled inside, cloaked in rain and mud, nearly collapsing onto the hay-strewn floor. He shoved the door shut again, barring the storm outside, and turned to see her. She peeled back her hood with trembling fingers. Dark hair clung wet against her face, her lips pale but fierce, her eyes sharp as a hawk's even under the shadows. She was no dainty saloon girl. Something about her carried grit, the kind born of running too long, too fast. "Thank you," she gasped, leaning against a stall. I needed shelter, just for the night." Elias's grip on the shotgun tightened before he slowly lowered it. He wasn't a man quick to trust. The storm outside screamed against the walls, but the storm inside his chest, was louder. "You'll catch your death out there," he said finally, his voice gravelly, and used to speaking more than a few words at once. "Sit yourself down. Warm up." She slid onto an overturned bucket near the lantern's glow, shivering as the light carved out her features. Sharp cheekbones, eyes too alert for a woman seeking simple shelter. Elias busied himself with fetching a dry blanket from a chest in the corner. He offered it without a word, and when her cold fingers brushed his hand, he flinched as though burned. "Name's Clara," she said, watching him carefully as she wrapped herself in the blanket. Her tone carried both weariness and defiance, like a gunfighter who hadn't quite holstered her weapon. "And you are—" "Elias," he replied simply. He felt the weight of her gaze, as if she was measuring the kind of man he was. Silence pressed between them, filled only by the storm's fury and the restless shuffle of horses. Elias leaned against the stall post, his broad frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. He studied her without meaning to, the curve of her jaw, the stubborn set of her mouth. She looked like someone who had known too much of the world's cruelty, and yet here she was, in his barn, asking for nothing but shelter. "You live out here alone?" Clara asked at last, her voice softer now, probing. Elias nodded. "Just me and the stock. Lonely place." She glanced around, her fingers tightening on the blanket, but maybe safer than town. That caught his ear. Safer from what? Clara hesitated. The lantern light flickered across her face, and something hard passed through her eyes before she looked away. "For men who'd rather see me dead than breathing." Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't press her, not yet. He'd learned long ago that some truths needed time to be spoken, but a knot of unease settled in his stomach. Trouble had a way of finding men who wanted no part of it, and he feared it had ridden into his barn with this stranger. Still, when her teeth chattered against the cold, he moved to the stove in the corner and struck a match, the flame catching quick. The glow softened the barn, casting warmth where a moment ago there had been only chill and shadow. Clara's eyes met his, the faintest smile tugging at her lips despite her exhaustion. "Didn't think I'd find kindness in a place like this." Elias looked away, busying himself with stacking wood. His throat felt dry, words thick. "Storm will pass by morning," he managed. "You can stay till then." But deep inside, beneath the steady thrum of rain on the roof, Elias knew the storm outside was nothing compared to the one her presence stirred within him. And as Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her eyes lingered on him longer than they should have, like a woman weighing whether this lonely rancher might just be the one soul she could trust. Chapter 3. Sparks in the lantern light. The storm showed no mercy. Rain poured from the heavens as though the whole sky had split open, and thunder rolled across the plains, rattling the barn doors on their hinges. Inside, the air felt thick, heavy with hay dust, smoke from the small stove, and something else, something Elias couldn't quite name. Clara sat near the lantern, the blanket draped over her shoulders, her damp hair drying in loose strands that framed her face. The lamplight softened her sharp edges, made her look less like a fugitive and more like a woman who had simply wandered too far into the storm. Elias busied himself with the horses, though his eyes betrayed him, stealing glances when he thought she wouldn't notice. He ran a brush down the mare's flank, his hand steady, though inside his chest his heart pounded like a hammer against wood. He wasn't used to this. Company, conversation, the scent of a woman filling his bar more potently than the smell of leather and hay. You don't say much, do you? Clara's voice cut through the quiet, lilting with a mix of curiosity and amusement. Elias cleared his throat, setting the brush aside. Don't have much to say. She tilted her head, studying him with those sharp, assessing eyes. Or maybe you just don't know what to say to a woman. Her words hit like a stray bullet, unexpected and true. Elias shifted, uncomfortable, adjusting the brim of his hat, though it wasn't needed indoors. His silence stretched too long, and Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile, teasing but not unkind. I was right then, she said softly. A man who lives out here all alone, not much chance for company. Elias swallowed hard, the heat from the stove suddenly stifling. He turned toward the lantern, the light flickering across his rugged face. Company don't stick, he admitted at last. Never did. Clara leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. The blanket slipped just enough to reveal the worn edges of her dress, the faint curve of her collarbone. She wasn't flaunting, but Elias felt the sight like a blow, his eyes darting away too quickly, his jaw tightening. You talk like a man who's been left behind, Clara murmured. He gave a bitter laugh, low and short. Can't be left behind if no one ever stayed. The word surprised even him. He rarely let thoughts slip out, especially not the ones that cut close to bone. Yet here, under the storm's howl and the lantern's glow, with the stranger's eyes holding his, he found himself speaking truths he hadn't voiced in years. Clara's expression softened. For a heartbeat, the steel in her gaze gave way to something gentler, almost wounded. She reached out, not quite touching, but letting her fingers hover just above the ruffle between them. Then maybe it's about time someone did. The silence that followed was louder than thunder. Elias's breath caught, his chest rising and falling, as if he'd just ridden miles at full gallop. He wanted to step closer, to bridge the small space between them, but his boots felt rooted to the barn floor. Instead, he busied his hands, striking a match and relighting the lantern where the flame had begun to die. The spark flared bright, then steadied into a warm glow, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Clara watched him, her lips parting as though she wanted to say more. Instead, she let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. You're different, Elias. Most men, they have asked for something in return by now. A roof, a blanket, food. Nothing's free out here. Elias's voice was rough but steady. I ain't most men. The way he said it, simple, certain, made something flicker in her eyes. Respect, perhaps, maybe even relief. She pulled the blanket tighter, her shoulders trembling less now, her gaze lingering on him longer than it should. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the barn for a heartbeat in stark white before plunging it back into shadow. Elias stood tall in the glow, his face half-lit, half-hidden, like a man caught between two lives. The one he had always known, the one that might begin with the woman shivering before him. The storm raged on, but inside the barn, another storm brewed, quieter, warmer, infinitely more dangerous. And as Clara's eyes met his once more, Elias felt the undeniable truth settle heavy in his chest. His life of silence was ending, and hers was entwining with his, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Chapter 4. Shadows from the Past. By morning, the storm had burned itself out. The prairie was washed clean, puddles glinting under a pale sky, the air fresh with sage and wet earth. Elias stepped outside the barn, boots sinking into the softened ground, and breathed deep. For a moment, the world was quiet. Too quiet, the kind that made a man's skin prickle with unease. Inside, Clara busied herself with the stove, coaxing a small fire to life. She wore her dress still damp at the hems, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and for the first time, Elias saw her in daylight. She looked different without the storm's shadows, more fragile, but no less guarded. "You cook too?" Elias asked, his voice gruff as he leaned against the doorway. Clara glanced back, a flicker of humor in her eyes. "Don't be fooled. I've burned more than I've saved, but a warm bite's better than nothing." Elias managed a faint smile, though it faltered as his gaze drifted to the road that cut across the horizon. His gut twisted. He was a man prone to suspicion, but the way Clara had spoken the night before, the weight in her voice when she mentioned men hunting her, still lingered. He stepped back inside, lowering his voice. "Those men you spoke of, they'll be looking for you, won't they?" Clara's hand stilled over fire. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a quiet sigh, she sat back on her heels, eyes downcast. "They already are." Elias's chest tightened. "What kind of men?" "The kind who don't stop," Clara said, lifting her gaze to meet his. There was no fear in her eyes, only a tired defiance. "A gambler in town. Name's Royce Mallory. Mean as they come. I took something from him. He aims to take it back with interest." Elias frowned, his jaw setting like stone. "Money?" Clara shook her head slowly. "More than money. Proof. Royce cheats men blind at his tables, leaves families ruined. I had a chance to take his ledger, the one that shows his hand. I thought I could run with it, maybe trade it for my freedom, but he found out before I got far." She pulled a small leather-bound book from beneath her blanket and placed it on the hay between them. The edges were worn, the pages crammed with names and numbers. Elias stared at it, then at her, his mind whirring. "You brought trouble straight to my door," he said, voice low but steady. Clara's chin lifted. "I didn't mean to. I needed somewhere to breathe, just for one night. I'll be gone soon." The words hit Elias harder than they should have. He tried to ignore the pang in his chest, the thought of her walking away into that wide, dangerous world. Still, he could not deny the truth. Trouble rode with her, and Royce Mallory's men weren't known for mercy. As if summoned by the thought, the faint sound of hooves carried on the morning air. Elias stiffened, his hand drifting toward the shotgun resting by the stall. Clara's face paled, but she didn't flinch. Through the barn slats, Elias caught sight of 3 riders approaching from the east. Dust rose from their horses' hooves. Even on the damp ground, they weren't drifting cowhands, too purposeful, too hard around the shoulders. "Mallory's men," Clara whispered, clutching the blanket tight. Elias felt his pulse hammer. He hadn't faced down outlaws in years. Not since he was a younger man riding the cattle trails, but the old instinct stirred. The horses shifted nervously, sensing the tension. He turned to Clara, his eyes locking with hers. "Stay put. Don't move till I say." She hesitated, then nodded, her hand brushing his arm in a fleeting gesture, small, desperate, enough to send heat surging through him. Elias squared his shoulders, stepping out of the barn into the rising sun. The riders slowed as they drew near, their leader a lanky man with scar that ran down his cheek like a jagged river. He reined in his horse, eyes narrowing at Elias. Mourning, the scarred man called, voice rough as gravel. "We're looking for a woman, dark hair, sharp tongue. Pass this way." Elias's grip tightened on the shotgun, though he kept it angled low. His heart thudded, but his voice came out even. "Ain't seen no such woman." The scarred man studied him, his lips twisting into a knowing grin. "Funny, folks say you don't get visitors out here. Be a shame if we had to poke around." Behind him, the other riders shifted, hands brushing the butts of their pistols. Elias's throat was dry, but he stood his ground, the morning light burning bright in his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his solitude. Only now it wasn't emptiness. It was responsibility. Clara's safety. The standoff stretched, tense as a drawn bowstring. The scarred man spat into the dirt, his grin fading. "We'll be back," he said finally, jerking his reins. "Don't get clever, rancher." The riders wheeled their horses, galloping back toward the horizon. Elias exhaled, his chest heaving. He turned back toward the barn, where Clara stood in the doorway, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "You lied for me," she whispered. Elias met her gaze, something unspoken burning between them. "Storm's not done yet," he said quietly. "Best you stay close." And for the first time, Clara didn't argue. Chapter 5, Blood and Gunpowder. The prairie sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the ranch. The air was heavy, too still, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Elias Carter knew the silence was a warning. Mallory's men would be back. Trouble never rode off without circling back for another bite. Inside the barn, Clara paced like a caged cat, her eyes darting to the road every few minutes. She clutched the ledger close, her knuckles white against the leather. Elias tried to focus on his chores, tightening straps, checking gates, but every scrape of metal, every creak of what felt louder than it should. "They'll kill you if they find out you're helping me," Clara said suddenly, her voice sharp, almost accusing. Elias paused, resting a hand on the mare's flank. "Maybe, but I don't stomach the idea of handing someone over to the likes of Royce Mallory." Her lips parted, as though she wanted to argue, but instead she just shook her head. "You're a fool." Elias turned, meeting her eyes with a steady calm that surprised even him. "Maybe, but I'll be a fool who stood his ground." The words hung between them, charged, until the distant thunder of hooves shattered the quiet. Clara stiffened, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Elias grabbed his shotgun, the weight of it familiar, solid in his grip. "They're here," she whispered. Dust rose along the eastern ridge, 3 riders growing larger by the second. This time they didn't stop at the fence. They galloped straight toward the barn, faces grim, pistols flashing in the dying light. Elias pushed Clara back toward the stalls. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice firm. She opened her mouth to protest, but the look in his eyes silenced her. The riders closed in fast. A shot rang out, the crack echoing through the prairie, which splintered as a bullet punched into the barn door. The horses inside shrieked, stomping in panic. Elias stepped out into the open, shotgun raised. His breath came slow, steady, his boots planted in the dirt. For 40 years he'd lived quiet, unnoticed, the world passing him by. But tonight, standing between Clara and the men who meant her harm, he felt something harden in his chest. "Back off," he shouted, voice booming against a storm of hooves. The scar-faced rider at the front sneered. "Out of the way, Carter. We ain't here for you. Just a girl." Elias's jaw tightened. "Ain't no girl here. And you best turn that horse round before I put you in the dirt." The sneer twisted into a snarl. "Your funeral, rancher." Gunfire erupted. The first shot grazed Elias's arm, hot pain ripping through his flesh. He staggered but didn't fall. Teeth gritted. He fired back, the shotgun booming like thunder, smoke curling from the barrel. One rider's horse reared, throwing its rider into the mud. The others wheeled, pistols flashing, bullets whizzing past Elias's head. Inside the barn, Clara crouched behind a haystack, her heart pounding. She saw Elias stumble, blood darkening his sleeve, and something inside her snapped. She grabbed an old revolver hanging from a post, rusty, barely cared for, and charged the doorway. "Elias!" she shouted. She fired clumsily, the bullet kicking up dirt near the riders. It was enough to draw their attention, enough to make them falter. Elias used the moment. He leveled his shotgun, fired again. The blast sent another rider tumbling from his saddle, his pistol clattering uselessly to the ground. The last man cursed, pulling hard on his reins. His horse spun, hoofs churning mud, and then he was gone, retreating toward the horizon. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged sound of Elias's breathing and the restless whinnies of the horses. Smoke hung in the air, sharp with the scent of gunpowder. Clara ran to him, the revolver falling from her hand. "You're hit," she cried, her fingers already tearing at the fabric of his sleeve to see the wound. Elias hissed through his teeth, but tried to wave her off. "Just a graze. Nothing serious." She pressed her hands to his arm anyway, her touch firm but trembling. "You could have been killed," she whispered, her eyes shining, her voice breaking against the weight of what had just happened. Elias looked at her, really looked at her. This woman who had stumbled into his barn, who carried trouble in her shadow but fire in her spirit. And for the first time in years, he felt alive, like the blood in his veins had purpose. "They'll be back," Clara murmured, fear and guilt mingling in her gaze. Elias nodded slowly, the pain in his arm throbbing, but his resolve harder than ever. "Then let him come," he said. "Long as I'm standing, they won't take you." And though the storm outside had passed, Clara felt it too, the storm that now raged between them, dangerous and undeniable. Chapter 6, Healing Hands. The barn smelled of smoke and blood. The horses had settled at last, though they still shifted restlessly, their flanks glistening with sweat. Elias Carter sat on a wooden stool near the stove, his shirt sleeve torn and dark with blood. His jaw was clenched, his face pale beneath the rugged lines of sun and work. Clara knelt before him, her hand steady despite the pounding of her heart. She had found an old tin box buried in the cupboard, a jumble of cloth strips, a bottle of whiskey, a needle dull with age. Her fingers trembled only once, when she cut away the sleeve to reveal the wound, a long, angry groove across Elias's arm, shallow but bleeding freely. "You should have stayed down," she murmured, dabbing the blood away with a strip of linen. "You're no gunfighter." Elias gave a faint grunt, his eyes on the floor. "Didn't need to be. Just needed to keep you safe." Clara's throat tightened. She pressed the cloth against the wound, harder than she meant to, and he sucked in a sharp breath. "Sorry," she said quickly. "Don't be," he replied, his voice low, gravelly. Better a sting now than a grave later. The lantern flickered above them, its glow throwing shadows across the rough boards, turning the space intimate, close. Clara leaned closer, the scent of whiskey rising as she poured it over the wound. Elias's muscles jumped, but he didn't pull away. He sat like stone, his large hands gripping the edges of the stool, His breath steady though sweat beaded on his brow. "You're tougher than you look," she whispered. He glanced at her then, his gray eyes catching hers in the lamplight. 40 years of quiet don't make a man weak. The words lingered, their meaning heavier than they seemed. Clara swallowed hard and bent again to her work. She threaded the needle, her fingers nimble, and began stitching the wound with careful precision. Her hands brushed against the skin, warm and rough, and every touch sent a ripple through her chest. "You've done this before," Elias muttered. "Not the first bullet I've seen," Clara admitted softly. She tied another stitch, tugging the thread tight. "Running from men like Royce, it leaves scars. Some mine, some not." Her voice wavered, and Elias tilted his head, studying her. "You don't have to carry it all alone." Clara froze, the needle poised in midair. No one had ever said that to her. Not like that, not with such quiet certainty. She looked up at him, and for a moment, she wasn't a hardened runaway or the woman with too many secrets. She was just a soul tired of running. "I don't know how not to," she whispered. Elias reached out then, his uninjured hand brushing against hers. His touch was awkward, hesitant, but steady. "Maybe I could help you figure it out." The words were simple, but they cut deep. Clara's eyes stung, though she forced a faint smile. "Careful, rancher. Say things like that, and a woman might start believing you mean them." "I do," Elias said, no hesitation in his voice. The silence that followed was thick, humming with something unspoken but undeniable. Clara tied the final knot and cut the thread, her hands lingering on his arm longer than necessary. The warmth of his skin seeped into her fingers, steady and grounding. "All done," she said softly, though neither of them moved. Elias shifted, his hand still over hers, his eyes locked on hers. For 40 years he had been silent, invisible, untouched. Now, in the low lantern glow, with this woman before him, he felt a lifetime of solitude cracking open. Clara's breath caught. She wanted to pull away, to remind herself that danger still rode close, that she couldn't afford this softness. But she didn't move. She let his hand cover hers, let the weight of his quiet promise sink into her chest. Outside, the prairie wind sighed through grass, carrying the faint call of a coyote under the stars. Inside, the barn felt like another world entirely, warm, fragile, alive. For the first time since she had fled into the storm, Clara felt safe. And for the first time in 40 years, Elias Carter felt seen. Chapter 7. The morning after. The sun crept over the horizon slow and golden, painting the prairie in soft light. The storm-washed air smelled of damp earth and sage, fresh and clean in a way Elias Carter had almost forgotten the world could smell. From the porch of his cabin, he stood with a mug of bitter coffee, staring out across the land he'd worked alone for half his life. The fences stretched long, the barn stood steady after the night's violence. But something had shifted in him. For once, the ranch didn't look empty. It looked like a place someone might actually come home to. Behind him, the cabin door creaked. Clara stepped out, wrapped in one of his old shirts, the fabric hanging loose on her frame. Her dark hair tumbled over her shoulders, catching sunlight in a way that made Elias's throat go dry. She crossed her arms, watching him quietly for a moment before speaking. "You were awake before the rooster," she said, her voice still husky from sleep. Elias glanced at her, then back at the horizon. Never was much for sleeping in. She came to stand beside him, barefoot on the porch planks. Together they looked out at the wide stretch of prairie, the silence between them heavier than words. Elias sipped his coffee, trying to keep his hand steady. He wanted to say something, needed to, but the words sat like stones in his chest. At last, Clara broke the quiet. "I should go." The coffee turned bitterer still on his tongue. He lowered the mug, his knuckles white against the tin. You mean back on the run? Her jaw tightened. Men like Royce don't quit, Elias. Not till they bled you dry or buried you 6 feet under. If I stay, you'll be caught in it. Elias set the mug down on the railing. He turned to her, his broad frame casting a shadow across the porch boards. Already am. Clara blinked, surprised. You don't even know me. Not really. Elias shook his head. Don't need to know all your past to see the kind of woman you are. You stood by me last night. Took up a gun when most would have run. His voice softened, rough but steady. That's enough for me. Clara looked away, her eyes glistening though she forced a laugh. You don't make this easy, you know. I ain't trying to make it easy, Elias said. I'm trying to make it right. She stared at him then, long and hard, as though weighing the truth in his words. The morning sun lit the lines of his face, the weathered skin, the scar on his chin from some long-ago fall, the eyes that carried both loneliness and something deeper now. You've been alone too long, Clara whispered. If I stay, you'll regret it. Trouble follows me like dust on boots. Elias stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Clara, I've lived 40 years with nothing but silence and empty nights. Only thing I'd regret is watching you walk away. The word struck her harder than any bullet. Her breath hitched, her chest tightening as she tried to hold onto the walls she'd built. But Elias stood there, steady as the land itself, offering something no one else ever had. Not promises of riches or escape, but home. Her hand lifted before she realized it, brushing against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath his shirt. You mean that, she said, almost to herself. He covered her hand with his own, his rough palm warm and certain. Every word. The prairie stretched endless before them. Yet in that moment, Clara felt the world narrow to the space between his heartbeat and hers. The wind stirred, carrying the faint cry of a hawk overhead. Clara leaned closer, her forehead resting against his shoulder, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe I don't have to keep running. Elias closed his eyes, exhaling slow, his hand tightening around hers. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe it too, that this woman, fierce and hunted, might choose to stay. The morning sun climbed higher, gilding the land in light, as if blessing new beginning neither of them had dared to dream until now. Chapter 8. The Rancher's Choice. The days stretched hot and brittle, the kind of heat that made the prairie shimmer like hammer brass. Elias Carter felt it in his bones, the calm before another storm. He'd spent the morning checking fences, moving stock, his every step weighed by the knowledge that Royce Mallory wouldn't stay away for long. A man like that never walked from a fight, not when he thought he'd been crossed. By mid-afternoon, the sound of hooves carried across the prairie. Elias straightened from the fence post, the hammer slipping from his hand. Dust rose on the horizon. More riders this time, at least 6, their silhouettes cutting sharp against the sun. And at their head, unmistakable even at a distance, was Mallory himself. Fine clothes spoiled by arrogance, a gambler's smile plastered across his face. Clara appeared at Elias's side, her hair loose, the sun catching its dark strands. She clutched the ledger to her chest, her knuckles white. "It's him," she said, her voice tight with fear and fury both. Elias glanced at her, then at the barn where his shotgun leaned ready. His arms still ached from the graze, the stitches pulling with every movement, but he squared his shoulders. "Stay inside," he told her. "I won't hide," Clara shot back. "Not from him. Not anymore." The riders slowed as they reached the front of the ranch, dust settling around their horses. Mallory sat tall in the saddle, his wide-brimmed hat tilted just so, a grin curling his lips. "Carter," he drawled, his voice smooth as whiskey and twice as dangerous. "You got something of mine. Best hand it over." Elias stepped forward, shotgun resting easy in his arms. Don't reckon I do. Mallory's eyes narrowed, his grin fading. The woman, and that little book she carries. I don't much care what you give me first. The words burned hot in Elias's chest. He didn't hesitate. You'll get neither. The air snapped taut, silence stretching like a drawn bowstring. Then Mallory laughed, sharp and cruel. A virgin rancher playing hero. Didn't think you had the grit. His hand flicked as men began to spread, forming a half circle around the yard. Clara moved to stand beside Elias, her hand brushing his sleeve. Her voice was low, trembling but fierce. If we give him the ledger, he'll leave. Elias shook his head, eyes locked on Mallory. No, a man like him don't stop. He'll take the ledger, then come back for you. Only way this ends is here. Clara's breath caught. For a heartbeat. She saw not the quiet, awkward man who had sheltered her in the storm, but someone else. Someone unyielding, forged in silence and solitude until the moment demanded steel. Mallory sneered. So be it. Gunfire cracked the air. The yard erupted into chaos. Horses rearing, bullets splintering wood, dust exploding under stray shots. Elias fired the shotgun, the blast echoing across the prairie. One rider fell from his saddle. Another wheeled away, clutching his side. Mallory's men returned fire, forcing Elias and Clara to duck behind the water trough. Splinters flew as bullets slammed into the wood. Clara gripped the revolver she'd taken the night before, her hand shaking. Elias caught her gaze, his voice firm despite the roar of gunfire. You stay down. I'll end this. But Clara shook her head, lifting the revolver with surprising steadiness. Not without me. Together they rose, firing in unison. Another rider went down, his horse bolting. The circle broke, Mallory's men scattering under the fury of their defense. At last, only Mallory remained, his pistol raised, his face twisted with rage. He dismounted slowly, stalking forward. You think you can ruin me, Carter? You think one nobody rancher and a runaway whore can bring me down? Elias stepped out from cover, shotgun leveled, eyes hard. I think a man's got to answer for what he's done. Mallory snarled, lifting his pistol. The moment stretched, hearts pounding, the prairie holding its breath. Then the crack of shot split the air. Mallory staggered, eyes wide with shock. His pistol dropped, clattering in the dirt. Clara stood behind Elias, revolver smoking in her hands, her whole body trembling. Mallory crumpled to the ground, dust rising around him, his final curse dying on his lips. Silence returned, broken only by the ragged sound of Elias's breathing and Clara's soft sob. She dropped the revolver, covering her mouth with shaking hands. Elias turned, catching her shoulders, steadying her. It's done, he said, his voice low, rough with relief. You're safe now. Clara's eyes glistened, tears cutting clean lines down her dust-streaked cheeks. She clung to him then, burying her face against his chest. No one's ever stood for me before, she whispered. Elias wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight against the wide, wild silence of the prairie. Then you'll never stand alone again. The sun dipped lower, gilding the land in firelight, the danger gone with the shadows of the day. And for the first time in years, Elias Carter wasn't just a lonely rancher. He was a man who had chosen, and who had been chosen in return. The prairie burned gold beneath the setting sun, the sky painted in streaks of crimson and violet. Dust swirled lazily across the yard, carrying the scent of sagebrush and a faint echo of a fiddle drifting from the saloon in town. Far down the trail, the gun smoke had cleared, the danger gone. Royce Mallory's men had scattered like coyotes before a storm, leaving only silence in their wake. Elias Carter stood on the porch of his cabin, his arm bandaged, his heart still thundering with the memory of the fight. Beside him, Clara leaned against the railing, her hair caught in the evening breeze, her eyes softer now, though still carrying that fierce fire. For a long moment, neither spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Elias turned to her, his voice low, steady, filled with the kind of certainty a man only finds once in his life. "I've been alone near 40 years, Clara. Never thought I'd find someone worth fighting for. But I'd do it again every day if it means you'll stay." Her lips trembled into a smile, eyes glistening in the fading light. She stepped closer, laying her hand against his chest. "Then I'll stay. Not because you saved me, Elias, but because with you I've finally found home." He pulled her gently into his arms, the horizon blazing behind them, two silhouettes against the endless sky. And as the wind carried the last echoes of gunfire away, only the quiet promise of love remained, stronger than the storm, brighter than the dust, eternal as the west itself.